Hi everyone, Teddy Baldassarre here. Now, have you ever been looking to buy a watch and you're kind of going down your checklist of, maybe what you want to buy next, and you're looking at all the features of the watch, checking it out, and then you're like, ooh, there's just like one or two things that are just preventing this thing from being perfect for you. Well, in this video, we're gonna be looking at a few collection of watches or just types of watches that are just so close to perfect and I think could probably be more popular if there were just some subtle modifications that were made by the brands. So in this video, all the watches that I'm going to be mentioning, I personally enjoy. I would not want to talk about a watch that was not good to begin with because that wouldn't really make a lot of sense. All these watches that I'm talking about are ones that I'm passionate about, I enjoy already, and what is currently being offered, but I think with some subtle things change could even be better. Now, who I'm gonna be speaking to and what kind of voice I'm gonna be speaking to is what I personally know, which is the enthusiast market, people that I am interacting with on a day-to-day basis, and of course, interjecting my opinions wherever I think they're appropriate. But a lot of this is going to be just, I think, inspired by what I see in comments, as well as just feedback that I get from thousands and thousands of people over the time that I've been posting videos online. And then also all the recommendations and changes that I'm gonna be presenting, they have to be realistic. So I can't just say, hey, drop the price by $3,000, then you got a great watch. I don't think that's fair. And then also things like, key features that would just be impossible, like talking about, hey, I want this automatic chronograph to be under 10 millimeters and it's using a Valjoux 7753 base. That's not gonna work with an 8mm movement inside of there. So everything that's mentioned has to be realistic and actually feasible by the brands themselves. Before we jump into this video, I do wanna mention two great new watches just made available on teddybaldassarre.com, and also were just released with the Metro Neomatic update, as well as the Tangente Neomatic update. So both of these watches feature a DUW 6101 movement inside of here. So we have a patented date mechanism that has these open apertures in the dial with a disc underneath that will actually highlight in a kind of more neon color the indicated date along the outside. Really cool in-house movements, very playful and very nomos in terms of their execution. Big fan of these. Check them out, teddybaldassarre.com. So now to begin here, I want to first look at Grand Seiko. So in the past few years, you have to give props to Grand Seiko and their ability to gain market share. I think for a long time they've been underappreciated. Now I think they certainly get the appreciation that they deserve for their high finish cases, high finish dials, as well as proprietary technology with their spring drives. Now, the change that I'm going to be suggesting is something that I see mentioned quite a bit, and it's gonna be involving two things. One is the dial symmetry of some of their watches, primarily when it comes to the power reserve, and then also when it comes to their bracelets. So the first thing with their power reserve, and I don't think this is always the case, and I think power reserve as a complication itself is quite useful, but there is, in this instance of talking about Grand Seiko, I think a stronger case to make, and just the fact that their dials are just so spectacular. And if anything is taking away from that just texturized dial surface that is so unique and inspired by Japanese just environments, really I think you do want to let that shine, really. And in some cases they do have the power reserve indicator on the flip side of the watch on the actual movement. This is available in their 9R01, so that's one of their higher end movements that they have, as well as some others, but mostly is going to be seen on the dial and is usually going to be kind of off axis. So typically at the 7 o'clock position is where you'll find it mostly. And this is probably the lesser of the two here that I'm going to be mentioning, but I know so many people talk about just giving way to the dial finishing itself, which I think is a fair point. And then also the symmetry of the dials too would be greatly improved without that power reserve indicator. On the flip side though, and I think this is a bit more objective, especially when you're thinking about increasing market share and being more of a sports-oriented watch, looking at many of their, say, Four Seasons collection, maybe you're talking about the spring drive, these cases coming in titanium, and I'm looking mostly at the SBGA 415, 413, and then also the Snowflake. Those models just getting a little bit of an improvement when it comes to the bracelet, primarily the clasp on those bracelets as well. So titanium as a just material itself is going to sometimes feel maybe a little bit cheaper just given the weight of it. That is, I think, not of course going to tell the whole story. If you understand what titanium is and just being a lighter material, you have to be able to look past that. But there are just shortcomings with the bracelets. Screwed in links would be nice, but I think the clasp is the main thing that could be improved. More micro adjustment opportunities, maybe on the fly adjustment. If they were able to incorporate something that was not extremely bulky, maybe something like a Tudor clasp that just has a nice fold over system, they don't even have to get that crazy with the pelagos, I think that would just make these watches that much more competitive. And when you're comparing it to, say, something like the Aquaterra or something from Rolex with the Oyster Perpetual, these would just be positioned that much more as being a great do-it-all type of watch, and I think would even allow Seiko to make even more strides in the great kind of distance that they've traveled in the last few years. All right, so now this next one is one that I certainly have tried to spearhead in many ways and have been pretty vocal about, and I have seen more and more people mentioning this, especially with the Watches and Wonders happening a few weeks back. A smaller option with the Pelagos, essentially giving it kind of the 58 treatment. That said, I think it is very important to draw this distinction on the upfront. Now, when looking at the Pelagos, I believe it is the perfect embodiment of this old school mission that just Tudor had in regards to military just dive watches. And the Pelagos, I think, best embodies this to this day. You have a titanium case, ceramic bezel. Also, you're getting an amazing clasp as well that's going to allow that on-the-fly adjustment, 70-hour power reserve with the MT5612, and substantial water resistance at 500 meters. It checks off all the boxes in regards to being a spec'd out dive watch, and that is great. The Black Bay appeals a bit more to those early mid-20th century dive watches, and the Pelagos I think is more appropriate to an actual diver and being a bit more tool watch in its nature. And that is an amazing thing, and I don't think they should get rid of that when thinking about this. But in regards to what could be changed, I think there's things that they can greatly improve. So the current generation of the Pelagos comes in a case size of 42 millimeters, and a few things about it I think are preventing it from maybe being more popular. One is going to be the actual case itself. 42 millimeters is not gonna be for everybody, and I don't think they should discontinue the 42 millimeter option, but if there was an option at say 40 millimeters, I think this would sell really well. In addition to that, if we're talking about the movement, so the movement inside of the traditional Pelagos, the MT5612, that is a movement that's gonna be a little bit thicker compared to the MT5402 in the Black Bays. And if they were able to adopt this movement, I could imagine that they could bring down the thickness even further, which is also a great thing. And imagine the combination, 40 millimeter case, titanium case, as well as being thinner. That thing is gonna wear amazing on the wrist for many people out there, and it's still gonna embody a lot of that just tool watch ethos that this watch is certainly going for. Also, one other small thing that I think would greatly improve it is the line text at the 6 o'clock. So currently there's like 5 lines of text. If they were able to transition to maybe a 3-line text, the original ETA models had way less text actually compared to these newer generations. And I think that just made the design feel a bit more whole in its execution and gave way to the other design elements, which I think the Pelagos just knocks out of the park. But I think these modifications really would go a long way in diversifying Tudor's portfolio and getting another dive watch in their catalog that would sell really well. As of right now, the Pelagos kind of seems like a bit like an afterthought compared to the very huge popularity that comes with the Black Bay. All right, so let's be real. When we're talking about Rolex watches and maybe things that they can improve in regards to selling them and being more popular, that's not something that typically goes hand in hand. But there is one model that you can probably make the exception, and that is the Rolex Cellini. Now, if you go to any AD, typically what you'll see in the case, and this isn't always the case, but mostly the case, is you'll see some Rolex Cellinis and then maybe some Lady Datejust. And that's about it that you're gonna find in the case. But you know, why is that with the Cellini, and why can't it just be improved? Because I think on the surface, in terms of its design and what the current just iterations are doing, they look fantastic. The problem is the price. We're talking about north of $15,000, and when you're getting in that range, we're talking about Lange Saxonias, Vacheron Constantin Traditionals, just for a little bit more money. And then also all the just many JLC dress watches that you can get, and probably doing it with a bit more of some flair and uniqueness in the process as well. But the Cellini on just its overall surface is a great watch, no question about it. So what I think would do very well is just simply offering a stainless steel option. And why I think this would be so compelling is if you just look on the surface in terms of what is being provided with the movement inside. But just to break this down, now the current Rolex Cellini model will have a Rolex 3132. So this is an older generation movement, has the 48-hour power reserve. Now, if you look over at the Rolex Oyster Perpetuals that have the 3230 calibers inside of them with a 70-hour power reserve, you then get to see how this thing could potentially stack up. Now, I'm not saying it needs to be as cheap as the Oyster Perpetuals that can be found for, when you can find them, under $6,000, but considering we don't have a bracelet on this thing, we're talking about a stainless steel case. I don't think the finishing of the fluted bezel or the bezel style is gonna be as maybe intense, or it might be as intense as, say, a Datejust. I think it would be reasonable to assume that you could see this watch perhaps priced under $7,000, maybe around $6,500. And if that was the case, I think these Cellinis would sell. And I know the dress watch, not as maybe popular as it was in years prior, but if you put Rolex on the dial, $6,500 price point, I think there's a lot more reason to look in the direction of the Cellini, which otherwise is a fantastic watch already. It's just the price and where it's occupied and who it's competing against, which are the main prohibitive factors for many people maybe looking in the direction of it. Okay, so next up we have a few different affordable dive watches that I think could be greatly improved. I love both of these lines, but I think with just a few adjustments, they could be even more popular. Now the first one I am very certain of, and I think this would sell very well, even more so, and could be probably one of the most just compelling value propositions in the market for a dive watch under $1,000. Still to this day, very good and one of my favorite dive watches in the range, and that is the Bulova Devil Diver. So this is a design that really pulls from the 1970s. You have that cushion style case, crosshair dial, retro markers, and partial cyclops set underneath the crystal, which is a very fun touch. But the main thing that's going against this watch for around $600, in which it's priced now, is the fact that it does feature an 8000 series Miyota caliber. What I think would really greatly improve this watch is if they could keep the price around the same and you get a 9000 series Miyota caliber inside. That would greatly improve this watch. This would add a hacking function to the movement. It would also increase the out-of-the-box accuracy and range of deviation and bringing that down to just make a more accurate movement. And then also you're upping the beat rate, so you're getting a cleaner sweep of that second hand as well in the process. I think you combine all those things together and get it around the same price, and I think they could do it because Bulova is a Citizen Group brand. This could go a long way in allowing these to sell a bit better. In terms of their wear, I think they're very good. They kind of remind me very much of the Seiko Turtles, which wear much smaller than the case size might indicate. So I think just with changing the movement would greatly improve this watch. You also could try to throwing in some Swiss movements inside of here, maybe like an SW200, for example, and getting it under, say, $1,000. I think that would also be compelling, in addition to maybe moving into some Miyota 9000 series if you want to stay at that price. So the next dive watch that we have here is the Tiso Seastar. Now the Seastar, there's no worries about the movement inside of here in the same way the Miyota was. You're getting an 80-hour power reserve, Swiss movement that is going to offer a lot of reliability. The challenge with the Seastar right now is just going to be the limitations in terms of the case size. So when you're looking at an entry-level Swiss-made dive watch, quite frankly, you're gonna have to start getting closer to $1,000. We're gonna start seeing them more readily available. And that's for the likes of, say, some models from Certina, maybe looking at Mito as an example. But I believe that the Seastar, in terms of what it's delivering, if there was a 40mm option, you keep the sapphire crystal, ceramic bezel, 80-hour power reserve, and just bring it down in terms of its case size, this thing would sell very well. There are just a ton of requests about this I see in the comments in passing. I know Tissot has to look at their overall offering a bit differently just because they are just so widely distributed, and many of the people that will buy a Tissot might just be looking for their first watch. They might be walking through a mall. You have to think about the buying journey when just recommending these type of things. So a 40mm versus a 43 might not work for those people, but I know for the types of enthusiasts that are looking for that Swiss dive watch, maybe the first entry-level Swiss dive watch, this would absolutely kill if it came in a 40mm case, and I think that would be more appropriate for medium to smaller wrists, and I know many people would appreciate it as well, because all the other specs across the board, what this watch is delivering, even from the design perspective, I think it does a lot of good. So next up, we have the Timex Marlin with the hand winding edition. So when these were reintroduced in 2017, kind of being as a reissue, they were immediately just very popular. People love these things, myself included. I think Timex did a very good job. And it really has opened the floodgates for them, now just offering up a ton of automatics, mechanical movements inside many of their watches. But I still think that these might be the best things that they have done so far in regards to just delivering what I think many enthusiasts wanted, while kind of really looking towards the past in a very respectful light. Now, the only problem with the 34mm Marlin hand winding is at 34mm. Now, I'm all about smaller case size watches, but I would imagine that there are going to be, for the same reasons I was talking about Tissot and them having to appeal to more of a mass market, there would be meeting somewhere in the middle. You have the automatics that are gonna be 40mm, those serve their own purpose, but from a dress watch perspective, they were able to kind of split the difference here, say 37mm. I think this would be much more appropriate. I love the retro Arabic numerals on this, the simplicity of the dial with kind of those sword style hands. Everything about this watch, I think, just looks the part, but if they were able to increase the case size a bit and just go away from the traditional 34mm, I think these would just sell a lot better and would also allow them to be a bit more casual, and I think people could lean into them a bit more, because 34mm, as much as I love smaller case sizes, it is limiting for many people out there because this is a small watch. All right, now my final watch to mention here, and that is the Omega Seamaster 300. Now, I personally like these more heritage issue design Seamaster 300s compared to the Diver 300s that are gonna be, of course, mostly affiliated with James Bond. I really just enjoy the looks of this. It's more classic in its overall just approach to the Seamaster and being, I think, true to the original 1957 edition. And I just like how it probably better represents a more traditional on-the-nose dive watch, which for some people might be a negative, but I enjoy it. I like the fact that there's no helium escape valve on these things, and that makes me really enjoy them a bit more. One thing that I think would have greatly improved these watches, though, is talking about the case finish as well as the faux lume. So the faux lume, I think, is the #1 thing that people say about these watches that probably pull them away. And I get that. I think in some instances it looks really good on Omega watches, like on the Seamaster Railmasters or the Railmaster trilogies. Something about the Railmaster design I think just works a bit more compared to the Seamaster design. Just something about the aquatic undertones of the design makes it a little bit more difficult to work. I don't necessarily hate it as much as many people. Some people just absolutely detest this. So that's why I'm mentioning it here, because that's always a comment every single time I mention these watches, and I think they could put a lot of that to bed if they did get rid of that. And another thing that from an enthusiast perspective, I don't think from a mass market perspective that this is going to actually be something that might benefit it, but so whether or not that's actually even a good thing to consider, that's for Omega to decide. But the case finishing on these watches. So there's a lot of mixing of polishing and brushing, and I think it looks a bit strange for a design like the Seamaster. The Seamaster is a professional dive watch, and I think just the overall approach with its just high polish on the interior surfaces and the outer links of the bracelet, it just kind of has this blingy effect. I just think that the watch would look so much better in an all brush case, but the no faux lume, that would probably be a more universal accepted idea. But all right, guys, those are just a few watches that I think could be improved with just some subtle modifications. Again, though, I love all of these watches. These are watches that I would consider buying, and I actually own some of these too. So it's nothing against these models. I just think from looking at just the macroeconomics of people, especially in the enthusiast market, it would greatly improve their ability to sell if they made these subtle modifications. But I'd love to see comments down below. Do you agree with these takes? Do you disagree? Love to see comments down below. And then also, if there's other watches and changes that you would see from brands outside of just the unrealistic thing, don't just say, hey, just drop the price, because I don't think that's really a fair take. You have to bring something else to the table. What would you recommend, and what would you think that would be very much held in high regard amongst enthusiasts and people that were buying watches if brands were able to make some adjustments? Also, definitely check out those new Nomos watches with the 2 update models from the Tangente as well as the Metro. We'll link to those in the description. Full authorized dealer of Nomos watches at teddybaldassarre.com, as well as 25 other brands. It allows us to make all this content possible. Also, if you want to stay up to date with the content, of course, subscribe here and then follow on Instagram as well to see some cool photos of watches. Thank you guys for 100,000 followers there on Instagram. Really do appreciate that as well. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I'll see you all very soon.